Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, Jerusalem psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post, the Pastor Shemini, is going to discuss the trauma of Aharon Hakohen. What we read in this week's Parsha is an interesting pasuk that suggests that Aharon Hakohen needed to be commanded, encouraged, urged, reassured by Moshe Rabbeinu to carry out his role, to carry out his job as the Kohen Gadol. He was told, "Do not fear. Approach the Mizbeach, Karev el Mizbeach." The pasuk says that he had to be told to draw near to the Mizbeach. But why was he hesitant? Why was he fearful of approaching the Mizbeach to carry out his role and to carry out the avodah in the Mizbeach? So Rashi points out and says that he felt these emotions of embarrassment and fear, but doesn't actually elaborate what was the source of his fear, of his embarrassment. And the Ramban elaborates. The Ramban explains that Aharon Hakohen was fearful and was scared to approach the Mizbeach, because when he saw the Mizbeach, his mind made him see the image of a bull, of a cow, which reminded him of the sin of the Egel Hazav, the one significant blot on his record, this significant sin of the Egel Hazav, which caused this immense trauma. It was ingrained into his mind. He couldn't abandon these thoughts about the Egel Hazav, about this sin that he had performed. The Ramban explains that it was just stuck in his mind, and this caused him to see, when he saw the Mizbeach, the image, and it seemed to be, and it reminded him of the Egel. It reminded him of the cow, and it reminded him of this sin that he had performed. And he was suffering from trauma. The way that the Ramban explains it, this fixation in his mind, in his thoughts, this sense of being unable to remove his thoughts from thinking about the Egel Hazav, was indicative of the symptoms of trauma. That seeing the Mizbeach acted, even though it was just the Mizbeach, and it didn't have a connection with the Egel, what happened in this through the trauma is that it served as a trigger. There was something in the image of the Mizbeach, there was something about the Mizbeach and the performance of the avodah perhaps that caused a trigger in his mind because of the trauma of the Chet Egel, to remind him and create this image of the Egel, of a cow, which caused this hyper arousal, which caused this trigger of traumatic thoughts and emotions of fear and embarrassment, and therefore he wanted to avoid as a behavioral response. He wanted to avoid the Mizbeach. What we know about trauma is often people engage in avoidance behaviors. It's a defense mechanism in order to protect themselves. But through avoidance, it actually strengthens and reinforces the traumatic memories, the traumatic emotions, and keeps the trauma, the cycle of trauma alive. So Aharon Hakohen, through these thoughts, the trauma, and created this trigger which reminded him that he saw this image of the Egel, of a cow, when he was looking at the Mizbeach, created this arousal of trauma, of embarrassment and fear, and this behavioral response of avoiding the Mizbeach. So Moshe Rabbeinu, therefore, had to reassure him, encourage, and perhaps actually it's more significant to say that he commanded Aharon to approach the Mizbeach. Rashi explains and says that Moshe said to Aharon, "This is your job, this is what you were chosen for." He's giving him this push to say, this is what you're chosen for, this is what you were chosen for, this is your role. You have the ability to take on this challenge. And therefore, this is actually an exposure therapy of coming closer, of gradually exposing himself to his fear, gradually exposing himself to the trauma of the Egel. And therefore, this pasuk, within these words of Karev el Mizbeach, there's such a depth of the psychological distress that Aharon Hakohen was experiencing because of the trauma of the Egel. And Moshe Rabbeinu was there to help him therapeutically, as Moshe Rabbeinu, as the leader of the Bnei Yisrael, as his brother, to help him therapeutically, to draw close, gradually expose himself to the trauma and to carry out his job as the Kohen Gadol and perform the Avodah on the Mizbeach. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.